Nora heart-tasted Stillwater Ford before she saw it. It was a chalky, red dust that coated her tongue, mixed with the metallic tang of hot wind. When the stagecoach finally jerked to a stop, the sudden silence was louder than the rattle of the wheels. She smoothed the skirt of her travel dress, the one that made her look like a respectable mail-order bride, and stepped down onto the baked earth. The sun was a violent white hammer on the dusty street. The town sign, proclaiming Stillwater Ford, Heart of the Panhandle, hung crooked and squeaked like a distressed bird. People not many stopped their chores to look. Their gazes were long, appraising, and notably lacking in welcome. She crossed the street to the low, wooden building marked Post and Telegraph. The air inside was blessedly cooler, smelling of stale paper and oil. A man with spectacles perched low on his nose sat behind the counter. "I'm looking for Ephraim Cole," Nora said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her stomach. "He's expecting me." The clerk didn't look up immediately, instead finishing an entry in a ledger. He finally slid the book aside and looked at her over his glasses. "Cole left a heap of trouble 3 weeks ago. Said he was going north. Left a few IOUs here and a lot of talk." Nora's carefully constructed world tilted. She had traveled hundreds of miles on the promise of a name, a contract, and safety. Left, she managed. "But we had an arrangement." The clerk shrugged, a gesture common to men who'd seen too many hopeful beginnings turn to dust. "Stillwater Ford changes plans. Ma'am, faster than the wind changes direction. He's got debts, and he's gone." Cole's abandonment was not just a crushing disappointment. It was a devastating crisis. Just as Nora was trying to reconcile this harsh new reality, the door creaked open, admitting a wedge of blinding sunlight and a shadow. Sheriff Amos Fitch stepped in. He was a thick man, too well fed for a town this lean, with eyes that moved like slow, oily insects over Nora's figure. The star on his chest was polished bright. "Well, look here," Fitch drawled, touching the brim of his hat, though there was no respect in the gesture. "A new face. The clerk says you're Cole's intended, seeing as Cole is a man of interest to the town council and by extension. Me, I'd appreciate it if you'd come down to the station, just to help me sort out a few things." His request was phrased as a courtesy, but the tone was in order. Nora's practiced calm fractured, her gaze fixed on the brass badge. It was a different shield, a different state, but the shape of the power it represented, the cold, proprietary gleam, was terrifyingly familiar. It was the same type of power that had stood guard over the building in Dodge City. The night she had run from a difficult past involving coercion, she prayed would never follow her. Her hands felt suddenly clammy. "I have no information. Sheriff, I just arrived." Across the street, where the smell of horses and hay hung heavy, Rowan Cade was working. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but silence was Rowan's habit, and silence often heard more than chatter. He was running a brush over the sleek, muscled flank of his black horse. Cole, the horse, usually high-strung, stood still under Rowan's slow, methodical touch, one of the few creatures in Stillwater Ford that seemed to trust him completely. Rowan had witnessed the stagecoach arrival and Fitch's subsequent oily pursuit. He knew Sheriff Fitch operated not on law, but on Luther Pike's payroll, Pike being the man who sought to control the water rights. Rowan watched the young woman stiffen under the sheriff's gaze. He recognized the look in her eyes, too, the desperate composure of someone balancing on a very thin edge. It was the look of a wild thing cornered, but pretending not to be. Rowan didn't like the sheriff's predatory smile, or the way the clerk pretended to be busy. Before Nora could formulate a steady refusal to Fitch, a third man walked into the post office, filling the doorway with his imposing height. Tate Mallory, Pike's ranch foreman and chief intimidator, stopped dead. He had the hard, careless confidence of a man who used a gun more often than a plow. Mallory's eyes narrowed on Nora. Then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be blessed," he drawled, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. "It's little Lily. Didn't expect to see the old face this far west. Heard you were still working in Dodge. Lily. The air went instantly cold. Nora gasped, her face draining of color as her old, despised nickname was spat out loud. The carpetbag slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud, scattering a spool of blue thread and a few carefully folded pieces of lace. The clerk averted his gaze. Sheriff Fitch, however, grinned, his suspicions seemingly confirmed. "Lily, is it?" he asked, stepping closer to Nora. "Now we're getting somewhere." Nora was paralyzed, her carefully crafted persona of the respectable Irish immigrant collapsing into the dirt and shame of her past. She could feel the walls closing in. It was Rowan Cade who broke the tableau. He left Cole standing unhitched and moved across the street with the economy of a striking snake. He didn't speak until he was standing directly between Nora and Fitch, his back to the woman. His presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't look at either man. He addressed the sheriff's star. "She's with me," Rowan said, his voice flat, dry as the prairie dust. "The seamstress. She was supposed to be at Cade's Wash 3 days ago, but the stage was slow. She's got my commissions." Fitch blinked, startled by Rowan's unexpected, quiet authority. He and Rowan had a history of unspoken tension, a shared enmity built on Rowan's refusal to be bought or threatened. "Cade," Fitch said slowly, assessing the danger. "Didn't know you had the cash for a tailor. Stillwater Fort ain't known for its fine lace." "The lace is for Martha Leary's mourning dress." Rowan lied smoothly, referencing a local, respectable widow. "She wants it finished by Sunday. Can't wait for your paperwork. Sheriff." Fitch paused, weighing the inconvenience of harassing Rowan Cade, a man with a reputation for quiet competence and unnerving self-control, against the immediate pleasure of intimidating the newcomer. He needed to keep things smooth for Pike. He shrugged, a gesture of concession. "Suit yourself, Cade. But if this seamstress runs up any debts, you answer for them." As Fitch turned to leave, Tate Mallory leaned close to Nora, who was still trying to gather her spilled belongings. His breath was sour. "Enjoy your time. Lily, a borrowed saddle always comes back to the stable." Rowan heard the hiss. The muscles along his jaw tightened, pulling the old, pale scar that ran down his cheek and neck into sharp relief. He didn't react visibly, but the simple, deep black of his eyes seemed to darken further, absorbing the light. The quiet, protective lie he had spun hardened into a commitment. He picked up the blue spool of thread and handed it to Nora without looking at her. "Let's go, ma'am," he said. Nora followed him out, her legs still shaky, the adrenaline making her feel both hyper-aware and dangerously weak. Rowan's horse, Cole, waited patiently. Rowan mounted quickly, then extended a hand to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took his calloused palm. He pulled her up onto the saddle in front of him with surprising gentleness. The movement brought her flush against his back. It was the first time she had been physically close to anyone since arriving, and the proximity of his strong, silent body, though a practical necessity, felt like an overwhelming invasion of the distance she had so fiercely maintained. They rode in silence, leaving the town behind and turning down a barely there track. The red dust swirled up and then settled again. Nora stared at the landscape dry, cracked earth stretching toward hills that were less green and more ochre. The silence between them was thick, weighted by the threats and the unspoken knowledge of her past and Cole's betrayal. She knew she owed him something immense, but debt had been the currency of her old life, and she refused to pay it again. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I don't know why you did that, Mr. Cade, but I don't pay, not in coin, and certainly not in any other way. I have nothing left." Rowan slowed Cole to a walk. He kept his eyes on the horizon, where the skeleton of a windmill appeared a broken monument to a failed promise. "The sheriff and Mallory." he said, his voice a low rumble just behind her ear. "They look for easy prey, and I don't like bullies." His explanation was brief and utilitarian. "As for payment, I've got a place called Cade's Wash. It's rough. We've got a small bunkhouse, 2 rooms. The other room is empty. You can stay there until you figure things out. No debt owed." Nora's gaze was drawn to the windmill. It was a ruin, its long wooden blades broken and askew, unable to turn in the perpetual wind. It stood over a small, muddy ditch that was clearly meant to be a creek. Stillwater Ford. What a cruel joke of a name. Her fiancé was gone. Her past had caught up to her in the form of Tate Mallory, and the only offer of safety came from a quiet man with a scar and a watchful demeanor, who had just risked his standing with the local law for her. "Temporary," she stated, her face rigid, still clinging to the formality of distance. "Just until I find work in a proper room." "Temporary," Rowan agreed. He didn't press her. He didn't even look at her. "No one owes anyone anything at Cade's Wash. You want to sew, you sew. You want to write letters, you write letters. You just need to sleep without fear for a few nights." He guided Cole toward the ramshackle, but surprisingly sturdy wooden shack nestled beside the dry creek and the broken windmill. Nora didn't thank him. She merely adjusted her position, shifting her weight, drawing the invisible, protective boundaries of her self-respect around herself like a shawl. She accepted the silence, the distance, and the offer, holding her fear tightly coiled beneath a mask of stiff independence. The conflict had begun. Cade's Wash was less a homestead and more a stubborn refusal to be blown away. The small, graying wooden house sat low against the brutal Stillwater Ford landscape, surrounded by a sparse corral and the skeletal remains of the broken windmill. The closest thing to a garden was a patch of hard-packed earth. The one dependable structure was the stable, smelling of fresh hay and animal warmth. The dry creek bed, a wide gash of cracked mud, underscored the central struggle of this place. Everything here, Nora noted, was worn down, but nothing was surrendered. Rowan showed her into the smaller of the 2 rooms in the house. It contained a narrow iron bed, a chest of drawers, and a wash basin. He pointed to a simple iron latch on the inside of the door. "It locks. You won't be disturbed," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. He set her carpet bag down. "I don't ask for company, and I don't expect conversation. I only ask that you sleep. Safe sleep is hard to come by in this country." His statement, brief and direct, was more profound than any sweeping declaration of protection. It acknowledged the fear she carried without demanding she explain its source. Rowan's presence in this small space felt large, not because of his height, but because of his sheer solidity. He was a man made of purpose and quiet intention. When he stepped back out, she locked the door immediately. It was a reflex born of years of having to protect her own space. That night, sleep was a distant luxury. The wind, which never seemed to fully stop in Stillwater Ford, whistled through the broken vanes of the windmill just outside, sounding like a high, continuous lament. It was the sound of everything that was broken in this town and everything that was still broken inside her. She got up, lit the small oil lamp, and sat at the chest of drawers. She pulled out the only tool she considered truly hers, a delicate fountain pen, a gift from a brief, forgotten time of hope. It was now damaged, the ink often leaking or skipping, refusing to flow smoothly. She dipped it and wrote a short, stark line on a piece of ledger paper. "I came here to live, not to be pitied." The ink bled slightly on the rough paper, mirroring her own inner turmoil. But the words held firm. Writing was her silent way of fighting back, of making sense of the chaos. She had chosen Stillwater Ford for a new beginning, and even if the contract was broken and the danger was here, she refused to become a victim again. Morning came with the sound of metal scraping stone and the scent of wood smoke. Nora finally emerged, feeling stiff and hollow-eyed. to find Rowan stirring coffee and frying beans over a small cast-iron stove. He wore a simple, dust-colored shirt and kept his back straight, even when leaning over the fire. "Morning, ma'am," he said without turning around. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The steam carried an aggressive, burnt aroma. He pushed 1 cup toward her. "This coffee is strong enough to mend both our hearts, if they happen to be cracked." Nora, bracing for another day of grim silence, heard the humor in his tone. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was the dry wit of a man who had seen the worst and decided to laugh anyway. She paused, the hot cup warming her cold hands. She actually let a genuine smile touch her lips, a brief, cynical contraction of her face. "A generous offer, Mr. Cade," she replied, "but I suspect if it's mending hearts, it's also strong enough to dissolve my teeth." It was the first time she had been anything other than guarded with him. Rowan finally turned, and the ghost of a smile lifted the corner of his mouth, the one untouched by the scar. It was a fleeting expression, but it held a flicker of shared understanding. "Drink slow," he advised. "The pace of this town is slow enough for strong coffee." After the meager breakfast, Nora gathered her sewing kit and walked back into Stillwater Ford. She went to the general store and put up a handwritten advertisement offering her services alterations, patching, and for those who could read letter writing and transcription. The response was immediate, but not encouraging. A few women, faces pinched tight from the sun and worry, came forward with minor jobs, but their whispers followed her like dust motes. The mail-order bride who got stood up. The woman Tate Mallory called Lily. "That stitch work is too fine for a woman who spent time in Dodge City," sniffed one sharp-faced woman, refusing her finished piece. Another pulled her young daughter away as Nora was writing a letter for the girl's father. "We don't need your kind teaching our children the alphabet." The social conflict was raw and simple. Nora realized that in Stillwater Ford, where water was scarce, reputation was even scarcer. The prejudice was a tangible wall. She swallowed her anger, accepted the pittance she was offered, and kept her hands busy. She had come to live, and living meant earning, regardless of the cost to her pride. While Nora navigated the town's silent condemnation, Rowan was out working. He had taken on the job of breaking a stubborn young Mustang for Martha Leary, the widow whose mourning dress he had referenced to Fitch. Rowan was famous for his patience with horses, a quality he rarely extended to people. He worked with the Mustang in the dust corral, using no rope and no whip, only his voice and his body language. Nora, walking back from town, stopped near the widow's ranch to watch him. He moved with a graceful precision that contrasted sharply with his rough surroundings and his own often stiff demeanor. He spoke to the horse in a low, constant murmur, and the animal, initially rearing and frightened, began to settle. Following the subtle shifts of Rowan's weight and focus, he worked with a gentle authority, not breaking the horse's spirit, but shaping its wild energy into trust. He refused any payment from Martha, simply stating, "She's a good horse, just needs respect." Watching this act of quiet, unpaid care, Nora saw a new layer to Rowan Cade. He treated the horse, the widow, and even her the same way, with an understanding of boundaries and a deep, underlying current of respect. He was gentle with things that were wild or vulnerable. Later that afternoon, Tate Mallory found his way to the only place to sit and drink in Stillwater Forward, the saloon, the Rusty Nail. He was drinking hard liquor and holding court, his voice loud enough to carry through the swinging doors. The general murmur of the town's worries focused on the water, or rather, the lack of it. Coal wasn't just left by his intended. Tate sneered to a group of men. He owed Mr. Pike a grand sum, a big sum. He was supposed to clear it with that woman's dowry. When she showed up empty-handed, Cole decided to run, and that seamstress, Lily, she's likely the collateral he hoped to leave behind. The shadow of Luther Pike, the real power in Stillwater Ford, felt heavier than the midday sun. Pike, the wealthy landowner, was not physically present, but his influence was everywhere, controlling the movement of every drop of water. The unspoken truth was that Pike wasn't just collecting Cole's debt. He was systematically buying up every small ranch that struggled with the growing drought. Using water control as his primary weapon, Cole had clearly been working for Pike and had set Nora up as a final, desperate bargaining chip. That night, back at Cade's Wash, Nora felt the tension escalate. The town's whispers had hurt, but Tate's direct threat to her identity was far worse. She was still reeling from the day's social confrontation. She finished cleaning up, locked her door, and then hesitated. She reached into her carpet bag and pulled out the small, square handkerchief she carried. It was made of fine, durable linen and dyed a clear, deep-sea blue. It was the only precious thing she had left, a symbol of the distant sea she remembered from her childhood in Ireland, and of the promise she had made herself to find a place of safety and clarity. She opened her window an inch, then folded the blue handkerchief and placed it precisely on the rough wooden sill. It was a fragile, silent message in the darkness. I stayed. I will stay one more night. Rowan was sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife, an action that felt peaceful rather than violent in his hands. He watched the light in Nora's window go out, and then saw the small square of blue fabric appear on the sill, a splash of color against the dark wood. He understood. It was a sign of her decision to remain, a temporary truce with the difficult reality she had walked into. A true smile, not the brief, cynical one from the morning, touched Rowan's lips. It was a secret, deeply personal acknowledgement of her small act of courage. He didn't speak. He simply stopped sharpening the knife, stood up, and looked toward the lower valley. The silence that followed, however, was immediately broken by a distant, rhythmic thudding. Thud, thud, thud. It was the unmistakable sound of sledgehammers driving wooden stakes and stones into the bed of the dry creek. Far downriver, Luther Pike was raising his barrier. The noise was low, constant, and inexorable, the sound of the earth being choked. The quiet, daily struggle for existence at Cade's Wash now had a harsh, amplified soundtrack, the pounding of Pike's work crew, systematically blocking the last remaining trickles of water. The slow rhythm of their daily lives was now set against the increasing, ominous tempo of the town's coming crisis. Nora had stayed for a night, but the town itself was beginning to buckle under the weight of Pike's oppression. Nora's sewing work often brought her into the offices of the few remaining legitimate businesses in Stillwater Ford, including the land registry tucked into the back of the general store. While waiting for a client, she saw a stack of official-looking papers tied with red ribbon. Curiosity, fueled by the instinct of self-preservation, won out. The papers were not land deeds, but contracts for water usage and rights of way. Glancing quickly, she recognized the scrawling signature of Luther Pike on every document. The contracts detailed complex, almost predatory agreements where Pike acquired the rights to any water flowing through a rancher's property in exchange for a meager fee and a promise of future development. The fine print ensured that Pike could, and often did, divert the flow entirely for his own, larger tracts of land. The truth hit Nora with chilling clarity. Pike wasn't just hoarding resources, he was systematically engineering the drought for the smaller ranchers. The forced lack of water was the engine driving the sales of desperate, parched land. The conflict of Stillwater Ford was not just a natural disaster. It was a ruthless strategy of corporate land grab, cloaked in legal paperwork. Later that week, while fetching a dress from Martha Leary's ranch, Nora voiced her discovery. Martha, a woman hardened by the prairie and by grief, nodded grimly. "It's the way of the land. Dear, the strong or the rich drink first." Martha then leaned in, lowering her voice. "About Ephraim Cole, your intended. He wasn't just a simple man looking for a wife. He was Fitch's bookkeeper for a time. Doing work for Pike, he handled all the debt collection, often involving the very contracts you saw. Cole was a coward, but not entirely corrupt. When he left, he didn't just run from you. He ran from what he knew. I heard he left a debt ledger at the post office, a detailed one. It shows who owes whom, and more importantly, why. If you can get that ledger, it might show that Cole wasn't the debtor, but Pike's pawn. That might clear your name. Nora. It might wipe away the stain of having been associated with him. Nora felt a fierce surge of determination. Her honor, the only thing she truly owned, had been sullied by Cole's association and Tate Mallory's venom. She needed that ledger, not for vengeance, but for dignity. It was the key to reclaiming her past narrative. Meanwhile, a thick envelope arrived for Rowan at Cade's Wash. It bore the postmark of western Kansas. The letter was from his older brother, Thomas, detailing a prosperous new ranch and a renewed offer. "Come back, Rowan. We're running 500 head, and the water flows year-round. You can build something real here. Put the war behind you, and stop fighting dry dirt. Life could be easier." The letter was a genuine lifeline, a way out of the grinding hardship of Stillwater Ford. It presented a clear choice: the quiet, ceaseless struggle in this arid, morally compromised place, or the promise of peace and prosperity elsewhere. Rowan sat on the porch, staring at the windmill's broken silhouette as he read the words, the choice tearing a fissure in his stoic facade. That afternoon, Nora went to the communal grain barn to deliver a repaired canvas tarpaulin. The barn was large, cool, and shadowed. She didn't realize Tate Mallory was waiting. He materialized from behind a stack of feed sacks, blocking the only door. "You're getting too comfortable, Lily," Tate sneered, his eyes hard and calculating. "Running around, talking to Martha, looking at contracts. Stillwater Ford doesn't need a little revolutionary. The land's already been spoken for." He stepped closer, invading her space. "I hear Cade is keeping you warm. Does he know what it takes to keep you warm?" Nora, though her heart hammered violently, stood her ground. "Get away from me. Tate, I'm not Lily, and I'm not yours to threaten." He laughed, a dry, ugly sound, and reached out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could close, the door burst open and Rowan stood framed in the sunlight, his silhouette stark against the bright afternoon. He hadn't seen the action, but he saw the danger. Rowan did not rush, and he did not draw a weapon. He simply walked into the barn, stopping exactly between Nora and Tate, placing his body as a silent, immovable barrier. He looked at Tate with an expression so devoid of emotion, yet so intensely focused, that it was more intimidating than any show of force. "She's done here, Mallory," Rowan said, his voice low and steady. "Get out!" Tate, surprised by Rowan's sudden appearance and his absolute calm, hesitated. He was the known gunslinger, yet Rowan's quiet menace the refusal to meet violence with equal violence. Opting instead for sheer, uncompromising presence forced him to retreat. Tate swallowed, his bravado failing in the face of Rowan's silent challenge. "You're asking for trouble, Cade," he muttered, backing toward the door. "Real trouble." Rowan didn't reply, just watched until Tate was gone. It was an act of profound, silent justice. Later, sitting on the porch as the sun began to dip, the silence between them was different, no longer guarded, but heavy with unsaid things. Nora finally broke it, speaking not about the incident, but about the deeper truth. Cole promised marriage, but he lied. He lured me here, knowing I was running from an old situation, a powerful man who wanted to control women. Cole intended to hand me over to his employer as a piece of leverage or pay off his debt. He was using me as bait. She finished quickly, exhaling years of pent-up shame and fear. Rowan was tracing the pattern of the wood grain with his thumb. He looked up, his gaze steady, devoid of pity or judgment. Instead of offering comfort, he reached up, unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, and pulled the rough cotton aside, the long, ropey scar, pale and smooth against his tanned skin, ran from his collarbone, across his jawline, and disappeared into his beard. "I was a cavalry scout," he said, his voice flat. "During a border skirmish, the commander gave a direct order to fire on a group of unarmed civilians suspected of aiding the other side. They were just farmers. I refused. I told him no. I was brought up on charges, and a friend, a good man, stepped up to defend me. They cleared my name, but the commander's aide put this on me the night before the trial, a little reminder of what happens when you defy a direct order. The paperwork says I was honorably discharged, but the rumor says I'm tainted. I know what it means to be accused of something you refused to do." Nora stared at the scar, the physical manifestation of his moral courage. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the raised skin, and withdrew them before making contact. They had both, in their own ways, suffered for holding on to their personal truth. The next day, they turned their shared focus to the broken windmill. They worked together, hauling fresh, strong lumber Rowan had saved from an old wagon frame. Rowan climbed the tower, his movements precise and strong, and Nora hauled the ropes, feeding him the heavy beams. They did not talk much, but their movements quickly harmonized. Rowan would call down a command. Nora would execute it perfectly. "We need the canvas for the veins," Rowan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I have plenty of heavy duck cloth. Not as good as tin, but it'll catch the wind," Nora replied. It was demanding, cooperative labor. They rebuilt the windmill's vanes not just as a machine, but as a symbolic act. The windmill was more than a pump. It was the mechanism of life. If the wind returned and the vanes turned, the water would flow again. It was an image of rebirth. Their work, however, was interrupted. Sheriff Fitch arrived at Cade's Wash, not on horseback, but in a buggy, carrying a rolled parchment. He stopped right beside the newly installed vane arms, disturbing the dust. "Rowan Cade," Fitch announced, unrolling the document. "I have a writ of injunction, secured by Mr. Pike. It states that the construction of any water diversion, dam, or pumping apparatus on or adjacent to Stillwater Creek, even the dry part, is hereby suspended and placed under the protection of Pike's property rights. You are ordered to cease and desist repairs on this windmill. You must sign this acknowledging receipt." Rowan climbed down, his face a mask of stone. He took the parchment, read the legal jargon that essentially granted Pike control over the entirety of the creek bed, and without a word, tossed it onto the dusty ground. "It's a broken creek, Fitch. It's not Pike's property." "It is now," Fitch snapped, his face reddening. "If you refuse to sign, I'll log your name as non-compliant and put you down as an enemy of the established legal order." "Write whatever you need to write," Rowan said, stepping over the discarded writ and walking back toward the woodpile. Fitch sputtered, but realizing the futility of confrontation, he furiously scribbled Rowan's name into a small black notebook, a ledger of grievances, and drove away. The small act of defiance resonated with Nora. That evening, back in town, she used her position as a seamstress to do more than just mend clothes. A group of children, restless and bored by the heat and the tension, gathered around her table. She gave them scraps of blue cloth the same shade as her cherished handkerchief. "This is for bravery," she told them, demonstrating how to make small ribbons and tiny flags. She engaged them in riddles and taught the older girls to stitch their initials. She was weaving herself into the community, not through declarations, but through quiet acts of warmth and kindness. The children's laughter and the small knots of blue fabric were the first, tentative evidence that community warmth was beginning to flow back, countering the coldness of prejudice. That night, the wind rose with unexpected fury. The broken windmill, with its new heavy wooden vanes, shrieked and groaned. It started to turn, slowly at first, then faster, its rotation ragged and incomplete due to a remaining structural weakness. The noise was terrifying, a loud, grating protest in the darkness. The movement promised water, the possibility of life returning. But the stressed wood and the uneven turning also promised imminent collapse. It was a climax of threat and promise, ringing in the silent valley as Nora and Rowan lay awake in their separate rooms, listening to the desperate song of the broken machine. The heat was relentless, a physical weight that pressed down on Stillwater Ford. The long drought intensified, settling over the land like a curse. Pike's strategic use of the concrete weirs and timber pilings, the casing, as the ranchers called it, had effectively choked the creek. Stillwater Ford was a cruel misnomer now. There was no water, still or otherwise, below Pike's land. The livestock suffered visibly, ribs showing starkly beneath dusty hides, their energy sapped by the ceaseless thirst. The conflict had moved past whispers and into survival, stacking the struggle against nature atop the struggle against Pike's social and financial chokehold. Nora, determined to earn her keep, pushed herself to work from dawn until the light failed. She took on every job the few willing women would give her, her sewing machine whirring ceaselessly on the porch of Cade's wash. One evening, deep into the night, she was wrestling with a thick, worn piece of bridle leather someone wanted patched for a harness. The needle slipped, plunging deep into the soft pad of her thumb. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain and exhaustion, and then bent over the machine, tears blurring the lamplight. It was less the pain of the prick, and more the sudden, overwhelming realization of her own fragility and the unending effort required just to exist. Rowan was beside her instantly. He took her hand gently, his thumb wiping away the bead of blood before she could stain the canvas. His hands, usually reserved for handling heavy tools or the sensitive mouth of a horse, were surprisingly steady and careful as he cleaned and wrapped the wound with a clean strip of cloth. "You'll put out an eye if you keep crying over a little scratch," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the task. Then he looked at the intricate, nearly invisible stitches she had laid into the leather patch. He gave a small, dry chuckle. "Your seams are straighter than the lies Cole wrote in his letters." The unexpected piece of wit, tossed out so casually and contextually, pierced Nora's misery. It didn't pity her pain. It acknowledged the quality of her work and the depth of her misfortune, mixing the two with a gentle absurdity. Nora felt a sudden, involuntary release of tension. She didn't just smile. She burst out laughing, a short, choked sound that turned into a genuine, watery laugh. The laughter felt foreign and liberating. Her body softened against the rigidity she had been holding for weeks. The small, humorous exchange had done more to heal her spirit than any direct sympathy could have. "I suppose that's the highest compliment a rancher can pay a seamstress." "Mr. Cade," she managed, pulling her hand back, though she noticed the lingering warmth where his fingers had been. The following morning, the whispers in town reached a fever pitch. The sheriff's office had conveniently leaked the story of Lily and her connection to Cole's debts. The narrative being aggressively peddled was that Nora was a professional confidence artist from Dodge City, sent to Stillwater Ford to execute a fraud on Ephraim Cole's behalf. The prejudice she faced before became outright hostile judgment. It was Martha Leary who stepped in to defend her, the widow, a respected pillar of the small community, walked into the general store where three women were loudly discussing Nora's origins. "You're talking about Nora Hart, aren't you?" Martha said, her voice sharp as the edge of a new trowel. "The woman who mended my dead husband's saddle and refused payment for helping with my filly. She's a hard worker. She's quiet, and she mends clothes better than any woman in this county." She paused, fixing the women with an unwavering stare. "What she did before she got to Stillwater Ford is between her and the Almighty. Here, she's only been honest. And if you've got nothing to judge but gossip, then keep your mouths shut and your hands busy." Martha's intervention was a critical moment, a vital collision against the rising tide of social condemnation, offering Nora the first public, legitimate ally she'd had. That night, the conflict moved from words to fire. Rowan and Nora were returning from a late trip to town when they saw the distant, pulsing orange glow near Martha Leary's ranch. Tate Mallory's attempt to terrorize the community was turning desperate. The hay storage near Martha's main barn was deliberately set ablaze. It was an act of economic warfare meant to serve as a warning to anyone considering resistance. Rowan immediately spurred Cole forward. Nora followed on foot, running with a sudden, desperate energy. When they arrived, the fire was confined but growing quickly. Martha was shouting, frantically trying to douse the flames with a bucket from a nearly empty barrel. Rowan didn't hesitate. He grabbed 2 empty buckets and shouted to Nora, "The well! It's still pulling up a little at the north side of the house." They worked as a seamless, silent team. Rowan formed a chain with Martha, tossing the heavy buckets back to Nora, who scrambled to refill them from the shallow, muddy well water. Nora had never moved so fast or worked so hard. The fire was small, but deadly. They managed to contain it to the hayrick and prevent it from spreading to the main barn and house, saving Martha's meager assets. In the aftermath, blackened and smelling of smoke and mud, they stood leaning against the water barrel, their chests heaving. Nora looked at Rowan's shoulder where a stray cinder had landed, leaving a small, raw, red patch on his tanned skin. Without thinking, she reached out and pressed the cool, uninjured pad of her hand to the burn. The small, simple touch was a quiet explosion. There was no pretense, no conversation, only the immediate, instinctive urge to soothe. Rowan looked down at her, the exhaustion and the recent danger etched on his face. The physical intimacy was subtle, a shared vulnerability expressed only in the heat of his skin beneath her palm. He didn't pull away, letting her hand rest there for a long moment. The pulse between them, accelerated by the rush of saving Martha's home, was now slowing to a shared, steady rhythm. The emotional thread between them tightened, more powerful because it was unspoken and necessitated by shared action. "Thank you," Martha said, her voice shaking slightly, looking at their proximity. "We did what needed doing," Rowan replied, stepping back slightly, his gaze meeting Nora's before quickly averting it. The following days were spent in a deeper commitment to the land itself, recognizing that Pike's legal obstructions were only effective where water flowed naturally. Rowan and Nora began to dig in the dry creek bed near Cade's Wash. Their goal was simple: to find the lowest point of the aquifer and open a new, shallow channel that might catch the scant remaining flow before Pike's dams took it all. It was brutal, honest labor. They used short-handled shovels and picks, breaking through the sun-baked clay. Sweat quickly soaked their clothes, turning the red dust to mud on their skin. The rhythmic sound of their tools hitting the earth and their labored breathing was the only music. Nora felt the calluses growing on her hands, replacing the delicate softness of the seamstress with the hardness of a worker. During a break, Nora looked at the muddy, exhausted man sitting beside her, sipping brackish water. "We're fools to fight this, aren't we?" she asked, her voice raspy. Rowan looked at the broken earth, then at the skeletal windmill they had partially fixed. "Maybe, but if we leave, they win without a fight." "No," Nora said, wiping mud from her face with the back of her wrist. "I mean, we are fools. You could be in Kansas. I could have gone back east. But we stayed. We are digging in the dirt for spite." Rowan looked at her, his expression softening. He realized it was the first time she had implicitly included herself with him, the first time she had used the word "we" to define their joint existence and their shared struggle against a difficult place. He didn't correct her. He let the words settle between them, heavy and meaningful. The reprieve from labor was short-lived. Sheriff Fitch rode out to Cade's Wash, not with a writ this time, but with an open threat. He dismounted at the property line, his posture aggressive. "Pike wants this to stop." "Cade," Fitch said, his voice hard, "you're getting too ambitious. You need to make a choice. It's either Pike's law or you dry up. Not just your land, but your future. He will crush every man who stands against him. I'm telling you this as a courtesy. Pack up and go to Kansas. Let the land go." Rowan leaned against the newly repaired post of the windmill, his silence the most potent form of resistance. He looked past Fitch toward the horizon. "I've chosen already, Sheriff," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his previous military defiance. "And it wasn't easy, but it was simple." Fitch cursed under his breath. Realizing the man would not yield, he mounted his horse, muttering, "You'll regret this, Cade. You'll regret it when it's too late." He rode away, leaving Rowan standing alone against the vast, empty threat of the drying land. A few days later, a sudden, powerful, localized squall hit Stillwater Ford. The wind was ferocious, a chaotic surge of energy. The windmill at Cade's Wash, with its patched vanes, began to spin wildly, faster than it ever had before. For a few glorious moments, the ancient, straining pump mechanism whined, and a thin, life-giving trickle of water was pulled from the deeper reserves, flowing into the channel Nora and Rowan had dug. But the triumph was brief. The high-speed rotation exposed the fundamental weakness in the tower that Rowan hadn't managed to completely fix. With a horrifying screech of protesting wood, one of the main support beams cracked and a vane tore loose. The windmill shuddered to a stop, the trickle of water dying instantly. The mini-climax was a powerful, symbolic failure. It wasn't enough to have good intentions or even strong work. It wasn't enough to simply wait for a helpful wind or a momentary blessing. The incident was an object lesson. Relying on luck or a temporary force would only lead to a more profound break. What was needed was not just a wind, but a decision, a unified, comprehensive plan. That evening, Nora found a stack of official paper in her room and a clean pen. She began to write letters, not as a hired scribe, but as a principal. She addressed them to the few smaller ranch owners she knew were struggling, including the ones who had scorned her. She detailed Pike's legal maneuvering and the proof she had seen in the contracts. She wrote not a plea, but an argument, calling for a meeting, a collective stand, a decision to unify. It was the first time Nora had actively and publicly taken the lead, exchanging the protective anonymity of the seamstress for the dangerous visibility of an organizer. She was no longer just running. She was building an alliance. Nora's pursuit of the debt ledger led her back to the Post and Telegraph office. The clerk, now seeing her not as a pathetic victim, but as a resolute woman who had survived a confrontation with the sheriff, was slightly more cooperative. After Nora paid a small fee for unclaimed mail, he handed her a thick, leather-bound book, Cole's Ledger. She took it back to Cade's Wash, her hands trembling as she opened it. The ledger was exactly as Martha had described, a meticulous record of all local debts, payments, and, most damningly, the explicit instructions for financial pressure originating from Fitch and Pike. The evidence of Pike's predatory land scheme was laid bare in Cole's neat handwriting. Nora scanned the pages, a cold sense of justice rising. Then she found it, a single entry, listed under Outstanding Due, noted a substantial fee marked for the retrieval of a key property, followed by the initials NTH. The date was the day after her arrival. The implication was sickeningly clear. Cole had set her up, and when she didn't deliver the cash they expected, the debt was immediately transferred to her, with the initials NH, standing for Nora Hart. The shock hit her like a physical blow. She had escaped the grasp of one corrupt system, only to find herself financially and reputationally bound to another through Cole's final, venomous act of betrayal. The moment this news, or rather, the misinterpretation of it, leaked, Tate Mallory seized the opportunity. He circulated the story immediately in town, claiming Nora was indeed Lily and the NH. In the ledger confirmed she was a paid operative of Cole's, who had now inherited his debts to Pike. The few small ranchers Nora had reached out to with her letters suddenly retracted their offers to attend the meeting. The theme of betrayal was starkly renewed. She was innocent, but the evidence was against her, and trust in a place like Stillwater Ford was a brittle thing. Rowan, hearing the quickly spreading rumors and sensing the danger, acted decisively and silently. He knew Nora would never ask for help, so he didn't wait for her to be proven right. He rode out of Cade's Wash under the cover of dusk, not returning until just before dawn. He had gone straight to the post clerk, not to reason, but to buy. He traded a heavy silver belt buckle, an old family heirloom from his Kansas days, for the specific page of the original ledger containing the NH entry. Back at his rough wooden workbench, Rowan studied the handwriting under the flickering lamplight. Cole's handwriting was recognizable from the surrounding entries. Rowan noted a subtle stylistic difference in the N and the H on that specific entry. He looked up the names of Pike's known associates. The real truth, the key that unlocked Nora's innocence, was revealed. The initials NH actually stood for Niles Hargreave, Pike's chief land negotiator and Cole's immediate superior. Hargreave was the one who had guaranteed Cole's fraudulent scheme. Rowan had bought Nora's name back, literally, with a piece of his own past. Nora, still reeling from the discovery of NH in the ledger, happened to see Rowan returning from his late-night ride. She watched him ride in, a dark shape in the pre-dawn glow, and then saw him quickly tuck something white, the ledger page, into his shirt before he came inside. Her immediate, fearful reaction, colored by her past traumas, was instantaneous and devastating. Rowan must be in league with them. He was dealing with Fitch or Pike, protecting himself, and perhaps even selling her out, using her as the bait he had saved her from. She confronted him in the center of the small house, her voice sharp with shock and rage. "Where were you? What did you buy?" Rowan, exhausted and covered in dust, met her challenge with his usual reserve, which she immediately interpreted as guilt. "It's none of your concern." Nora. "It's every bit my concern," she shot back, stepping dangerously close. "I saw you hide something. Are you in business with Pike? Is that why you stay here? Is that why you got me out of the sheriff's sight? Was I always the collateral? Tell me the truth." Rowan. "Are you trading with the people who built that dam and who ruined this place?" The argument was fierce, their first major collision. Rowan's silence, his refusal to explain the delicate, protective gesture he had made, only stoked her suspicion. He saw the genuine, deep-seated fear in her eyes, the fear of a person who has been betrayed too many times to trust an unverified truth. "I am not like them," Rowan finally said, his voice hard with wounded pride. "If you think I am, then you don't know me at all." "I know the kind of man who deals in shadows," Nora yelled, stepping back, the distance between them now absolute. "You should go. Leave this place and save yourself. Staying here only invites trouble, and you'll regret staying. The warning, the genuine desire to protect him from the danger she carried, was twisted by her own fear into an act of rejection. Rowan watched the door slam on her small room, the sound echoing in the silent house. He stood there for a long time, listening to the pounding wind that had become the soundtrack of their struggle. He walked to her closed door and pulled the blue handkerchief from his pocket, the one she had left on the sill the night she decided to stay. He slipped it beneath the latch, a silent promise. "I won't regret fighting the fire," he whispered to the closed wood. "I won't regret standing my ground. I'll only regret it if you don't kiss me again. Nora." He knew the phrase was audacious, a massive overstep of the boundaries they had so carefully maintained, but it was the only way he could express the depth of his commitment to her presence. It was a promise of an intimate future, thrown against the wall of her terrified past. He smiled then, a tired, infinitely patient curve of his mouth, and walked away to tend to Cole, letting the night and the silent gesture do its work. The next morning, Nora woke up, the memory of her harsh words stinging her conscience. She saw the folded blue handkerchief beneath her door. She pulled it out, her heart catching in her throat. And then she saw the piece of ledger paper lying neatly on her washstand. It was a careful, precise copy of the debt page, made by Rowan. Beside the entry for Nubbit H, he had circled the letters and written a single, clear note: Niles Hargreave, Pike's man. He had cleared her name, proving that the debt was to be collected by Hargreave, not from Nora Hart. The understanding of his true motive, the secret trip, the protective silence, the willingness to be misjudged hit her with an overwhelming wave of guilt and relief. She had been wrong, profoundly wrong. She ran out of her room, finding Rowan by the stove, pouring coffee. "Rowan," she choked out, holding the copy, her eyes full of tears. "I am so sorry. I should never have accused you. I keep waiting for the trap to spring." Rowan only looked at her, his expression serious but calm. He slid the tin cup toward her. "The coffee is going cold." "Nora," he said, the simple but dry joke instantly diffusing the drama. "A good woman's apology isn't worth much if the coffee gets wasted." It was his gentle, humorous way of accepting her apology without demanding penance, a healing through the mundane. With the truth of the ledger now confirmed, they focused on finding tangible proof against Pike and Hargreave. Nora remembered that Cole had been living in the abandoned church structure on the edge of town, using it as a hideout before he fled. They rode out together, Rowan's protective presence now fully accepted. The abandoned church was a desolate stone building, long since taken over by the wind and the dust. Inside, under a crumbling pulpit, they found a small cache of Cole's things, a half-eaten tin of biscuits, a pair of worn boots, and a box of personal correspondence. Rowan kept watch while Nora sifted through the letters. She found a bundle tied with string letters from Cole to Hargreave, detailing the growing pressure on the small ranchers and, most importantly, Cole's increasing panic about being unable to deliver the final collateral Nora. Cole had clearly been writing a confession, or at least a record of Pike's crimes, before he fled. The letters were not a full confession, but undeniable proof that Cole was Hargreave's agent in the water conspiracy. As dusk settled, they leaned against the stone wall of the church, the letters secured, the shared victory, the collaborative effort of securing not just her name but a chance for justice, changed the space between them. Nora looked up at Rowan, the last of the sunlight catching the sharp angle of his scar. She reached out, her movement slow and deliberate, and gently touched her lips to his. It was a kiss of gratitude, of shared defiance, and of choice. It was a soft, seeking pressure. Nothing more, but it was fully hers, offered without request or coercion. Rowan remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the wall on either side of her, not holding her, not moving toward her, giving her all the space and time to decide the rhythm and the length of the embrace. The stillness was a profound act of respect, honoring the boundaries she had fought so fiercely to keep. When Nora finally drew back, she was breathless, the kiss brief, but holding the weight of everything they had endured. Rowan simply looked at her, his eyes warm. The moment was about choice and safety, a boundary not broken, but voluntarily lowered. The community meeting was set for the main grain barn, a neutral ground large enough to hold the disparate factions of Stillwater Ford. Nora stood on a makeshift platform constructed of wooden crates, facing a crowd roughly split down the middle between the wary and the desperate. The air was thick with skepticism and the dry smell of stale grain. Nora, dressed in her simple, practical dress, spoke with a clear, steady voice, projecting the strength that came from knowing she finally spoke the truth. She laid out the evidence, the contract analysis detailing Pike's water rights manipulation, the copy of Cole's ledger page showing N.H. as Niles Hargreave, and the intercepted letters confirming Cole's role as Pike's pawn. Cole didn't run because of debt. He ran because he couldn't face what he helped Pike do, Nora concluded, holding up the ledger copy. "The debt, the dam, the rumors about me, it's all part of the same plan to force you off your land. If we don't stand together now, Pike will own the water, and then he will own every one of you." A murmur ran through the crowd. Half of the faces remained hard, unconvinced that the word of a newcomer could outweigh the powerful presence of Fitch and Pike. But the other half, the farmers who had seen their wells run dry and their cattle suffer, looked at each other with dawning understanding. They recognized the pattern of the squeeze. Rowan, standing quietly in the back, stepped forward once Nora had finished. He didn't speak to the morality of the situation. He spoke to the practical danger. "Pike won't allow this meeting to stand. Tate Mallory and the sheriff will move against you tonight, perhaps against the grain stores, or maybe the few cattle you have left." He proposed an immediate, organized defense. "We need watch shifts to protect the remaining stores and livestock. We are too spread out to defend every home, but we can protect the resources we share." Rowan, the self-proclaimed solitary man, volunteered for the most dangerous shift, the late watch, when dark deeds were most often done. His offer was a quiet challenge to the community, asking them to trust his action more than his words. The ranch owners who had already lost too much stepped forward first, accepting his organization. Nora, meanwhile, was turning her skills to a symbolic effort throughout the day. She took the small, leftover scraps of her sturdy blue linen, the color of her handkerchief, and began sewing them into small flags and pennants. She rode out with Martha Leary to every rancher who had committed to the alliance, tying a small blue flag onto their gatepost, the color standing for the promise of water and the necessity of unity. The blue was a simple, visible declaration of alliance, a quiet rejection of the red dust of resignation. The town was now subtly marked, split between the silent majority and those who flew the color of hope. Tate Mallory, predictably, chose to disrupt the growing unity. He rode toward the grain barn just as the sun was setting, accompanied by two of Pike's hands, riding in a show of force. Tate was drinking, reckless, and angry at the sudden opposition. He fired his pistol into the air, scattering a group of children near the meeting point. Rowan, already on watch duty, spurred Cole out from the stable. He carried his rifle, but his movements were measured, without panic. "Back off, Mallory," Rowan commanded, his voice reaching the foreman easily across the quiet evening air. Tate laughed, pulling his rifle. "You think you can face us all? Cade, we're just collecting what's owed. Like your little whore." He fired a shot intended to strike the ground near Rowan's horse, forcing a reaction. Rowan was faster, but more controlled. He didn't aim for Tate's body. He aimed for the object closest to Tate's arrogance. With a sharp crack, Rowan's bullet hit the heavy brim of Tate's hat, tearing it from his head and sending it spinning into the dirt. The shot was precise, deliberate, and humiliating. Rowan calmly lowered his rifle. "Consider that a warning. Mallory, you don't spill blood over a hat, but you'll learn that I won't miss next time." He paused, his gaze fixed on the now stunned foreman. "Hitting the hat is enough." The sheer calm and the display of controlled skill instantly demoralized Tate's small contingent. Tate, face pale with shock and rage, gathered his men and retreated, leaving his ruined hat where it lay. Rowan had achieved a silent, moral victory without bloodshed, demonstrating that true strength lay in restraint and accuracy. Back at Cade's wash, Nora found Rowan examining a shallow scrape along his collarbone, where a splinter of wood from a nearby fence post had caught him during the skirmish. The incident had been brief, but the threat was very real. Nora carefully cleaned the scratch, her hands gentle. "You could have been killed." "Rowan, he was shooting for real." Rowan gave a weary shrug. "If I hadn't moved, he'd have hit Cole. I won't risk the horse." Nora chuckled softly. An intimate, shared understanding. "You'd risk your hide for that beast." "It's not my hide I worry about," Rowan admitted, wincing as she dabbed antiseptic on the cut. He looked down at her, the moment of shared danger deepening their connection. "Does it hurt?" Nora asked, her tone soft and caring. Rowan gave her a simple, honest look that reached deeper than the surface. Only if you stop touching me." The rough humor was a defense, but the underlying sincerity was unmistakable. The affection between them was warm, sincere, and entirely free of pretense. They stood very close, the scent of antiseptic and dust mingling. The tension that had been building since their morning argument and subsequent shared kiss came to a head. Rowan gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. He leaned in, and their kiss was deeper this time, a quiet confirmation of the shared commitment they had forged in the face of fear and fire. Then, Nora suddenly pulled back, her eyes wide with fear. Not for herself, but for him. She put her hands on his chest, creating a physical barrier, the old, deeply ingrained habit of protecting others from the consequences of her difficult past resurfaced. "Stop," she whispered, her voice strained. "You need to go. You have a chance in Kansas, a good life. If you stay, if you tie yourself to me in this fight, you'll lose everything. They will ruin you. You'll regret staying." Rowan looked at her, his smile slow, deep, and utterly resolute, the lines around his eyes crinkling. He repeated the words he had whispered to her door the night before, speaking them into her fear. "I won't regret fighting the fight, Nora, and I won't regret standing my ground. I'll only regret it if you don't kiss me again." The phrase, connecting his commitment to her presence and affection, was perfect. It broke the spell of her fear. Nora's eyes filled with tears, but her mouth curved into a genuine, relieved smile. She laughed through the tears, a shaky, beautiful sound of acceptance and surrender. She immediately dropped her head, leaning her forehead against his chest, holding him not in fear, but in shared certainty. The fragile peace was shattered shortly after. Sheriff Fitch, humiliated by Tate's failure and driven by Pike, rode through Stillwater Ford, publicly declaring martial law and imposing a severe curfew. He used the recent arson attempt at Martha's barn, which Tate had committed, as the pretext. Fitch then rode directly to Cade's wash, demanding that Rowan publicly turn over his rifle and pistols, citing an old, rarely enforced law against armed assembly. Rowan met Fitch at the porch. "These are my lawfully purchased firearms. Sheriff, they are for the defense of my property and my person. I will not hand them over to men who work for Pike." The conflict had escalated from land rights to fundamental rights and the rule of law. Rowan's defiance pitted the true spirit of the Frontier Code self-defense and property rights against the corrupted legal authority of Stillwater Ford. Fitch knew he couldn't force the issue without a bloody fight, so he simply added the charge of defiance of local order to Rowan's record and retreated, leaving the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Determined to use their time constructively under the imposed curfew, Nora transformed the grain barn into a small schoolhouse by night, using the last of her lamp oil. She began teaching the women and children of the unified ranches to read and write. She used her old, ink-stained books and the local newspaper. It was a defiant act of hope, a commitment to empowering the community against ignorance and exploitation. The flickering light of the barn, full of silent, focused learners, was the new beacon of Stillwater Ford. As the women and children left the barn, the last vestiges of the sunset faded. Rowan was outside, scouting the perimeter. The wind, which had been a constant companion, suddenly shifted, carrying a sharp, acrid scent from the distant southern horizon. It was a dry, choking smell, unmistakable and terrifying to anyone who had lived on the plains. It was the scent of wildfire. The threat had come full circle. The conflicts of man were about to be overshadowed by the sudden, merciless chaos of nature. A massive, unseen calamity was rolling toward Stillwater Ford. The prairie fire hit Stillwater Ford not as a creeping danger, but as a violent, wind-borne assault. The heavy, smoke-choked air was suddenly pushed by a savage shift in the wind, driving the licking crimson line of flames directly toward the scattered ranches of the Alliance. The dry, brittle grass ignited with a roar. Nora and Rowan immediately recognized the catastrophe, but almost simultaneously, They recognized the malice. Tate Mallory, accompanied by a small crew, was seen on the ridgeline, using brush fires to actively herd the main blaze toward the properties marked with blue flags, effectively turning the natural disaster into a targeted act of criminal hatred. What started as petty vengeance was now attempted mass ruin. Rowan, the calm strategist, barked immediate orders to the gathered ranch hands. He divided their small, exhausted force, one group to cut a fire break behind the barn, another to focus on saving the livestock, and a small, critical team for wetting down the roofs of the main houses. "We save the people first, the animals second, the property last," he commanded, prioritizing life over assets. Nora, her fear replaced by fierce focus, took charge of the most vulnerable. "The stone church! Everyone to the abandoned church!" she shouted, directing the women and children toward the thick brick shelter, the only truly fireproof structure available. She herded them quickly, her voice a soothing, firm counterpoint to the roaring blaze. As she led the last of the children away, a terrible realization struck Rowan. His eyes were drawn back to the old windmill at Cade's Wash, now engulfed in flames, its dry wood catching instantly. It was the symbol of their struggle, their home. He paused for the barest fraction of a second, his body trembling with a desire to save the machine they had labored over. But the distant cry of a terrified child solidified his choice. He turned his back on the burning windmill, abandoning the symbol to rush toward the more immediate human need. The machine was secondary. Life was primary. His moral compass spun back to true north. Nora reached the relative safety of the stone church cellar, counting heads with Martha. It was there, amidst the terrified chatter, that she remembered her most vital piece of leverage. The fountain pen. The broken fountain pen, the one that skipped and leaked, was tucked away high up in the gables of the grain barn's attic, the temporary schoolhouse. She had left it there because inside its hollow brass barrel, she had secreted Cole's most damning letter, a full, detailed confession of Pike's conspiracy that Cole had written before he fled. It was the last, undisputed piece of evidence that the NH ledger and Cole's confession were real. Without a word, Nora broke from the group and sprinted back toward the main grain barn. She couldn't risk the community's future on a copy or a verbal account. She had to retrieve the original. Rowan saw her running and understood instantly. He cursed under his breath, recognizing the reckless courage of the woman he loved. "Nora!" he roared, abandoning his post at the firebreak and running after her, plunging straight into the thickening smoke. She reached the loft, the air already thin and scorching, and scrambled desperately among the rafters. She found the pen, its cool brass a sudden comfort in the heat, just as the roof beams above began to groan. Rowan arrived, his eyes stinging and red. He saw her, silhouetted against the growing inferno. He didn't lecture. He simply grabbed her, sweeping her up into his arms in a sudden, powerful movement, cradling her close to his chest as he descended the ladder, fighting the urge to cough. "Idiot," he managed, his voice hoarse from the smoke, but a tremor of affection running through the anger. "Stubborn fool. Why did you risk that?" Nora, clinging to him and the brass pen clutched in her hand, simply retorted, "Stubborn, but alive." The shared humor, a brief, sharp piece of wit exchanged in the face of death, was a testament to their established intimacy and defiance. They emerged from the choking smoke and chaos near the edge of the creek bed, where the fire was still ravenous but slightly less intense. It was there, against the backdrop of the inferno, that Tate Mallory found them. Tate, his face blackened, his anger boiling over the failure of the fire to break the alliance, stood before them. Leveling his rifle, he had gone too far to retreat. "It ends here, Cade," Tate snarled, pressing the cold barrel hard against Rowan's temple. "You and your whore go down together. Pike wins." Nora didn't flinch. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the muzzle of the rifle and Rowan's head. She held up the ledger copy in one hand and the brass pen in the other. "You can kill us, Tate," Nora announced, her voice echoing with sudden, shocking clarity over the roar of the fire. She was speaking not just to Tate, but to the few onlookers, a small, terrified group of ranchers and some of Fitch's men who had arrived, stunned by the scale of the blaze. "But you can't kill the truth. This pen holds Cole's final confession, proving Pike and Hargreave conspired to ruin this county. The ledger shows Hargreave, not me. You will be held responsible for the arson and the murder of 2 people who carried the evidence against your boss." The sudden public declaration, the visible evidence, froze Tate. He hesitated, his target now obscured by the courageous woman, his crime now magnified by an audience. It was then that the tide truly turned. Martha Leary and several of the allied ranchers, alerted by the gunfire and the chaos, arrived. Dust-covered and resolute, they carried shovels and pitchforks. Not guns, but their combined presence was an undeniable force. The community, seeing Nora's bravery and Tate's heinous act of arson, finally swung its full weight toward justice. Tate, panicking, pulled the trigger. Rowan reacted instantly, shoving Nora to the side while simultaneously dodging the blast. Rowan's shot was fast and precise. He didn't aim for Tate's heart. He aimed for the weapon. The bullet hit the foreman's wrist, making him drop his rifle with a cry of pain. But the real, seismic event happened next. Tate's wildly aimed bullet, deflected by Rowan's action, struck a large, exposed timber piling a central support for Pike's temporary water diversion dam. Located just upriver, the impact, combined with weeks of constant pressure from the shallow, trapped creek water, was too much. With a deep, grinding groan, the support post splintered. The timber and concrete structure of Pike's illegal dam gave way. A sudden, powerful surge of water, the accumulated trickle of the long drought, burst through the breach. It wasn't a flood, but it was a deliverance. The water surged down the dry creek bed, not only quenching the immediate flames licking at the edge of the ranches, but creating a temporary barrier that the fire, driven by the strong wind, could not cross. The moment was an explosion of natural justice. The symbol of Pike's oppression, the dam had been violently broken, and the water, the ultimate source of life, had arrived just in time to save the community from the fire. Sheriff Fitch rode up, witnessing the destruction and the dramatic turn of events. He saw his control dissolving. He dismounted, pulling his revolver, attempting one last grab for authority. "Rowan Cade is under arrest for armed resistance and inciting riot. Stand down." But Fitch's words held no power. The ranchers, the exhausted women, and the frightened children spilled out of the church cellar. They saw the water, the fire break, and the bravery. They saw Rowan and Nora standing together. In a spontaneous, powerful movement, Martha and the ranch women stripped off their blue flag ribbons, the ones Nora had given them, and tied them around their arms. They silently formed a unified line, the blue cloth against their dusty shirts, stepping forward to shield Nora and Rowan from Fitch. The community was an absolute, human wall of resistance. Fitch, looking at the unified, resolute faces of the people he was supposed to protect, realized his lawlessness was over. He looked from the blue line to the surging water, then back to the defeated Tate Mallory. Without a word, he slowly unpinned his badge, dropping the brass star into the dirt before mounting his horse and riding away in silent defeat. The high point of the conflict had passed. Tate Mallory lay trussed up by the remaining ranch hands. Pike's chief conspirator, Hargreave, was nowhere to be seen. A thin, delicate rain, almost like silk, began to fall from the smoky sky. It was barely enough to settle the dust, but it was sufficient to declare the fire's end and mark the end of the high drama. The town had survived the crucible. The dawn broke over Stillwater Ford, not with the usual blast of white sun, but with a muted reddish glow filtered by lingering smoke. The air was heavy, smelling of burnt grass, wet ash, and the faint, sweet scent of mud. The land was scarred, but not defeated. Nora and Rowan stood by the ruins of their windmill at Cade's Wash. The tower was a charred skeleton, but the pump mechanism, buried in the ground, was intact. The core task of healing the land and the community began with this simple, shared labor. They spent the morning digging, their movements slow and rhythmic, hauling away the scorched timbers and burying the base of the new, stronger main post they had salvaged from an old, abandoned wagon. The work was a physical, cleansing ritual. Each swing of the axe, each lift of the heavy post, chipped away at the trauma of the night before. They worked in near silence, their communication limited to simple directions and shared grimaces of effort. The shared labor became their language of healing, proving that they were builders, not just survivors. As the morning advanced, the final debris of the old, corrupt order was swept away. Sheriff Amos Fitch, his face pale and drawn, rode out of Stillwater Ford without a word to anyone. The star he had dropped in the dust remained untouched. He had lost his master, his authority, and his nerve. Niles Hargreave, Pike's smooth-talking land agent, had been less fortunate. He had tried to flee during the chaos of the fire but was recognized by a group of ranchers. They had tracked him down, tied him securely, and were now preparing to hand him over to federal marshals in Santa Fe, along with Cole's damning evidence. The rule of law, though slow and distant, was being summoned back to Stillwater Ford by the community itself. Martha Leary, riding up to Cade's Wash with a wagon load of fresh bread and coffee, found Nora resting against the new post. The widow, her eyes clear and resolute, handed Nora a document. It was the formal agreement establishing the Stillwater Ford Water Cooperative, a fund for future irrigation projects and maintenance. The men and women of the Alliance voted, Martha said simply. You brought the evidence and the courage. Rowan is our soldier, but you are our keeper. You're in charge of the cooperative funds and the records. Nora, you'll keep us honest. Rowan, taking a long drink of water, watched the exchange, his eyes full of pride. He gave a small, dry chuckle that was rich with affection. Looks like you've been promoted, ma'am, he teased. From humble seamstress to the owner of the creek, the boss of the wash. Nora's heart swelled. The title wasn't about power. It was about acceptance and respect, something she had never thought she would earn. It's a dry job, Mr. Cade, she replied, her voice soft with emotion. But the view is excellent. Their fragile, hard-won peace was tested that afternoon. Rowan received another letter from his brother in Kansas, delivered by a passing rider. It contained a detailed plan, blueprints for a substantial ranch house, and a bank draft, a down payment on the shared life Thomas was offering. It was a concrete invitation to ease, comfort, and the ability to finally put the bitterness of his past behind him. Rowan held the paper, staring from the promise of prosperity to the dusty, rebuilding reality of Stillwater Ford. He looked at Nora, her hair dusty, her hands calloused, her eyes alight with a fierce commitment to this difficult place. The lure of Kansas was real, a chance at an effortless life, and Rowan was genuinely torn. It was a choice between the easy path and the right one. Later, sitting on the small porch, the tools of their labor scattered at their feet, Nora felt the tension radiating from him. She knew what the letter contained. She chose that moment to dismantle the last internal wall she had built. You deserve that, Rowan, she said quietly, without looking at the letter. The green land, the clean start, the quiet. You should go. And you, he asked, his voice low. Nora turned, her gaze direct, and began to speak, allowing all the ugly, painful details to spill out her life in Dodge City, the nature of her coercion, the cold transaction Cole had intended. She spoke of the fear of being seen, of being known, of being judged by the history she carried. Rowan didn't interrupt. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He simply reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the bandaged cut on her palm. His touch was firm, grounding, and completely without judgment. He accepted her history as simply another part of the woman he had chosen to stand beside. "Thank you for telling me," he said when she was finished. "But I don't look backward. Nora, I only look at what's standing right here now." They began to talk about the windmill project again, using the conversation as a proxy for their future. They decided to use the heavy, fire-scarred wood from the old main beams for the new struts. "It's strong wood," Rowan noted, running his hand over the scorched grain. "It survived the fire, and it survived the fall. Anything that survives deserves to stand tall again." The conversation was a quiet affirmation of their relationship. They were the fire-scarred wood, the surviving pieces, strong precisely because they had endured the fall. That evening, they sat on the newly repaired wooden porch, the air cooler now that the sun had fully set. The sounds of the valley were different, no longer the heavy thudding of Pike's Dam, but the gentle, rhythmic turning of the pump they had just finished fixing, pulling up a steady, albeit small, amount of water. Rowan put his arm around Nora, pulling her close. It wasn't a sudden, passionate gesture, but a slow, careful enclosure, respecting her need for space while offering the undeniable comfort of his solid presence. She leaned into him willingly. They didn't speak of love or promises, only of the day's events, the necessity of rebuilding the fences, the future water shares. The physical closeness was intimate, expressed not in haste, but in the long, slow duration of their embrace. Their hands met, their fingers intertwining in a slow, cherished movement. He held her just a bit tighter, his chin resting on her hair. The quiet feeling of safety was a profound intimacy, a recognition that they were truly home in each other's presence. "I'm here," Rowan simply whispered, the phrase a stark, simple declaration that dismissed the Kansas offer and the trauma of his past. Nora looked up at the silhouette of the new windmill, already turning steadily in the night wind. "We need a name for the ranch," she said, her voice soft. "Cade's Wash sounds too harsh now." Rowan smiled, a rare, genuine expression. "Let's put your name first," he joked gently. "As is right, as you are in my heart." The new windmill's turning was a constant, solid sound, no longer shrieking in protest, but spinning with a slow, durable hum, the steady, certain rhythm of a shared life beginning to take root in the scarred earth. The final word on the Stillwater Ford water controversy arrived 3 weeks later via a federal courier. The decision was absolute, based on the overwhelming evidence of fraud and Pike's disregard for established law. The Federal Land Office ordered the immediate and permanent dissolution of all Pike's illegal dams and diversions. Furthermore, the court froze Pike's local assets, facing ruin and possible charges. Pike and his major investors abandoned Stillwater Ford, leaving their vast, dry holdings to be carved up by legal reclamation. With the threat removed and the water rights secured, Nora focused her considerable energy on building hope. She transformed the back section of the grain barn from a simple night school into a functioning community reading room. The shelves were stocked with worn books and donated periodicals. The centerpiece was a small, locked glass cabinet where she carefully placed her broken fountain pen. It was a humble, silent symbol. The writing instrument that once leaked and failed to speak the truth was now enshrined as the emblem of the community's rediscovered voice and the end of the suppression. Rowan, meanwhile, found his calling in the youth of the town. He spent his afternoons in the corral, patiently teaching the ranch children how to handle horses, mixing discipline with quiet wisdom. He knew the importance of trust and control. "Don't ride faster than your heart can keep up," he would joke to the bouncing children. "If your horse is ahead of your purpose, you're going to fall." The kids would shriek with laughter, drawn to the silent man's unexpected humor and deep expertise. The last piece of the old conflict was removed when Tate Mallory was finally led away by the federal marshal, bound for the territorial prison. He was taken past the Cade's Wash Ranch, past Nora and Rowan, who were mending a fence together. Tate stopped, his face bruised and humbled, stripped of his violent arrogance. He looked directly at Nora, and for the first time she saw a flicker of the human man beneath the brute. "Lily," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong. About you. Sorry, Nora." It was a small, choked apology. A final, ragged thread of humanity that gave a deeper, more profound meaning to their victory. Nora merely nodded, acknowledging the remorse without offering full absolution. The moment added a dark, necessary layer of realism. Justice wasn't just about punishment, but about the possibility of even the hardest soul finding a sliver of truth. In the days that followed, Rowan worked tirelessly, helping the widows and the older ranchers repair the fences and wells that had suffered in the drought and the fire. He refused payment from Martha, simply stating that the community was the only pay he needed. The people of Stillwater Ford understood his quiet language. They did not thank him with words, but with silent, continuous respect. Nora would often find small offerings left on the porch: a fresh egg, a pie, a carefully repaired piece of leatherwork, and most movingly, the ranch women would sometimes place a small, folded scrap of blue fabric the color of her handkerchief and their alliance on the hitching post at Cade's Wash. It was a constant, wordless thank you for the woman who had helped them find their voice and the man who had protected their lives. One day, Nora received a small, heavy parcel delivered by the postal rider. It contained a cheap, tarnished silver ring, clearly Ephraim Cole's, and a brief, miserable letter of confession. Cole had died of fever while running north, and the letter was his final attempt to clear his conscience, fully detailing Pike's conspiracy and begging Nora's forgiveness for using her. The package was his last, broken tie to her. Nora looked at the ring and the letter, feeling no anger, only pity for the man's weakness. She walked down to the creek, which now flowed with a slow, steady stream thanks to the new well pump. Without ceremony, she dropped the cheap silver ring into the flowing water. She watched it sink, releasing herself entirely from the stain of his cowardice and the false promise of their arrangement. Her past was gone, washed clean by the water she had helped restore. That evening, the entire cooperative gathered at Cade's Wash for an outdoor dinner. The women brought cornbread, beans, and stewed peaches. The new atmosphere of security was intoxicating. They ate under the stars, laughing and telling stories of the terrible night of the fire, the fear now turning into shared folklore. Rowan and Nora sat side by side, surrounded by their new friends. Nora looked around at the faces Martha, the children she taught, the ranchers whose land was saved. She felt a powerful, deep sense of belonging. This dusty, scarred, difficult patch of ground was, definitively, home. Rowan was less at ease with the social closeness. He kept his silence, but his hand rested on the back of Nora's chair, a constant, solid point of connection. As the conversation flowed around them, Nora noticed him fumbling with a box of matches. He pulled out the cardboard cover, flipped it over, and began writing on the back with a stubby pencil. He would write a few words, cross them out, write them again, and shake his head in frustration. He was drafting a proposal, the words for a marriage, the final, clumsy commitment of a man who was better with horses than with heartfelt speech. His ordinary, nervous fumbling was deeply charming and entirely genuine. As the night grew late and the last of the community members departed, Nora and Rowan walked back to the porch. The only sound was the gentle whirring of the windmill and the chirping of crickets. Nora didn't need any words, written or spoken. She simply rested her head on his shoulder. A profound, silent act of surrender and trust. It was the language of absolute faith, a comfort that spoke louder than any marriage proposal scratched onto a matchbox. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in soft, bruised shades of rose and gold, the light cleansing the last of the smoke from the air. A brisk, stiff wind was turning the vanes of the newly repaired windmill with purpose. their rhythmic sound a steady heartbeat for the valley. Rowan was waiting for Nora beneath the tall, solid structure, its salvaged, fire-scarred wood posts standing firm. He held something small in his hand, something he had been carving with infinite care. It was a ring, fashioned simply from a piece of the scorched wood he had cut from the old, fallen beams. It was dark, durable, and perfectly round. Nora walked toward him, her step light, her eyes clear. The past was settled, the danger had retreated, and she was walking toward her future. Rowan reached out and took her hand, placing the wooden ring in her palm. "This piece of wood," he said, his voice husky with emotion, speaking without a trace of his usual dry humor. "It was in the fire, it was broken and it fell, just like us. But we fixed the core, and now it stands, and we stand with it." His words were the most sincere and profound commitment he could make, a promise rooted not in fleeting romance, but in shared endurance. Nora didn't wait for him to drop to one knee. She looked him straight in the eye, embodying the maturity and strength of her choice. "I choose to stay, Rowan, not because I'm afraid to run anymore, but because I want to build something here with you. I choose this." Rowan's hand trembled slightly as he released hers, a rare show of vulnerability from the man of stone. He lowered himself onto one knee in the dust, a gesture that held the weight of all the battles he had fought, both internal and external. "If you choose to stay with me," he said, his gaze locked on hers, the wind whipping his hair. "If you wear this ring, if you kiss me again, Nora, I will be here until the wind stops blowing. I will never leave this place, or you." His words echoed the crucial line of the story, linking his vow of permanence to the intimate moment of choice they had shared during the fire. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, pulling him up gently from the dust. Their kiss was long, deep, and warm, a kiss of final, chosen acceptance that held all the gratitude, respect, and quiet passion that had been building between them. It was a sacred, deliberate moment. It was followed by a long, treasured embrace, foreheads touching, shared laughter bubbling up as relief and joy finally broke through their guarded exteriors. It was a commitment forged in fire and sealed with respect. The peace of the morning was soon interrupted. Martha Leary and several of the allied ranch families, who had been riding out to check on their fences, arrived at Cade's Wash. They had seen the scene beneath the windmill, understood the significance of the moment, and had quietly returned to celebrate. In a beautiful, spontaneous ceremony, the community gathered beneath the turning vanes. Martha, acting as the unofficial minister of the prairie, led a simple, heartfelt blessing. The ranch women began tying long, thin streamers of the blue linen, the same cloth Nora had used for the Alliance flags, onto the spokes of the windmill's wheel. As the wind caught them, the new blue streamers spun rapidly, a festive, moving testament to their shared victory and the start of a new life. It was a true prairie wedding, witnessed and sanctioned by the community they had helped save. The core themes of their story were realized in that moment. Justice had been served, not by a single hero, but by the relentless pursuit of truth, the ledger and the pen, and the subsequent failure of the lawless dam, the law of the water. Forgiveness and humanity were demonstrated by Nora's release of Cole's ring and Tate's mumbled remorse. Maturity was evident in Nora's journey from running away to actively building a home. And love, simple, sincere, and enduring, was defined not by passion, but by the safety and profound respect Rowan offered her. The tone softened to a gentle, enduring warmth. The sounds of the valley were harmonious, the deep, steady hum of the windmill, the distant, delighted shouts of the children as Rowan began another riding lesson, and the shadows of Cole running free in the newly fenced corral. The American West remained a harsh, unforgiving landscape, but the future felt bright with potential. In the end, Nora and Rowan understood the ultimate lesson of the frontier, a lesson bought with fire and dust, Where the wind has a voice, people live by reliance on one another. Where the land is dry, water is justice. And love is simply the way we hold each other up. The quiet dignity of standing on the right side of the fight had been costly, but it had brought them a true home, built not just of wood and stone, but of the strength of the person standing beside them. Thank you for listening to Nora and Rowan's story. We'd love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Tales. Give this video a like, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.